the 24th of December. 1857. Christmas Eve in Ashwood, Georgia. The town glowed like a jewel against the blackness of winter. Every window flickering with candlelight. Every parlor humming with laughter, songs, and the sweet smell of roasted meat. For the white families of Ashwood, it was a night of hymns and feasts, of polished silver and velvet gowns. But only a few miles away, inside the slave quarters of the Crawford plantation, the night was made of frost and silence. The fire was too small to warm bones, the air too heavy with grief to carry song. Among the shadows sat a woman named Rosa, 28 years old, her hands rough from years of labor, her back trained to bend under commands, her lips taught to smile through pain. For as long as she could remember, Rosa had been told that silence was survival. That obedience was her only chance at seeing another sunrise. But on that Christmas Eve, Rosa was done surviving. In the big house on the hill, the Crawford brothers laughed and drank, unaware that their feast would end in blood. Rosa had spent years feeding their fires, cooking their meals, tending their rooms. Tonight, she would wield the same axe she once used to split wood, but not for warmth, not for service, for justice. This was the night the Crawford dynasty would fall, not with petitions, not with prayers, but with the swing of steel and the memory of a love stolen too soon. Before we continue, let me ask you, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below, we'd love to know. Ashwood, Georgia. 1857. The town was wrapped in ribbons of celebration that winter, with candles glowing in polished windows and church choirs echoing through cobblestone streets. But the Crawford plantation stood apart, both magnificent and rotten at its core. From afar, it looked like a palace, white columns, sprawling verandas, and acres of fertile fields. Yet inside its borders lay two worlds, so close and yet so distant they might as well have belonged to different planets. The big house shimmered with Christmas finery. Garlands hung above doorways. Pine needles spread their fragrance through high-ceilinged halls. And the Crawfords filled crystal glasses with imported brandy. Their laughter rang out as though it were the only sound that mattered. A few hundred yards away, in the slave quarters, the picture was starkly different. The cabins were bare, their walls thin, their fires weak. Rats scurried along the corners, and coughs echoed louder than carols. The air smelled not of roasted duck, but of damp straw, sweat, and mildew. In one of those dark cabins sat Rosa. She had been born into Ashwood's soil, her mother having died, giving birth to her on the same land that had owned generations before them. Rosa was what they called a house girl. She was trained to polish silver until it gleamed, to balance platters of roasted meat without a tremor, to press linen with such precision that her masters would boast of her skill. At the age of 28, she had mastered the art of silence. To the Crawfords, she was a shadow, a pair of hands, a body without voice. But within her, a storm had long been gathering. The storm had a name: Malcolm Carter. Malcolm had arrived at the Crawford estate 3 years earlier. Tall, strong, with eyes that carried something dangerous hope. Unlike those born beaten into submission, Malcolm's spirit seemed unbroken. He worked in the fields, breaking horses, plowing rows, hauling cane. Yet his shoulders never slumped the way others did. At night, when the stars leaned low over the plantation, Rosa would meet him behind the smokehouse, in the shadows where even the overseer's lantern could not find them. Malcolm spoke of freedom, not like a dream, but like a plan. He whispered about Ohio, where men could work for wages, and children were not born into chains. He told her he would save every coin he could, that someday he would buy not only his freedom, but hers too. Rosa never spoke much. Her silence was her shield, but she listened, and each time Malcolm's calloused hand brushed against hers, something inside her heart beat faster, like wings fluttering against the bars of a cage. Their bond was noticed, Of course it was. On a plantation, secrets were brittle things. Edward Crawford, the eldest brother, called Rosa into the parlor one evening. The fire was burning low, and the heavy curtains kept the night at bay. Edward poured a glass of port, studied her as one might study livestock, and spoke words that would haunt her forever. "I see how you look at him," Edward said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "And I see how he looks at you. You want to be free. Don't you work hard through Christmas. Keep your head down. Make this house shine, and when spring comes, perhaps I'll sign the papers." The promise was as smooth as honey. But like honey, it was sticky, deceptive, impossible to wash away once it touched the skin. Rosa dared not tell Malcolm. She carried the lie quietly, pressing her forehead against his chest that night, holding him until the lanterns burned out. For the first time in years, she let herself believe in something brighter than survival. 2 weeks later, Malcolm was gone, sold overnight to a man 2 counties west. Rosa learned of it only after he was already shackled and marched away. She confronted Edward the next morning, her voice calm, her face steady. "You said spring," she whispered. Edward looked up from his cup of coffee, smirking. He wasn't part of the bargain. "You are. Be a good girl, Rosa. Spring is still coming." She left the room without a word. But as she passed through the kitchen, her fingers brushed the handle of the cleaver that hung by the hearth. They lingered there just a second longer than necessary. The news of Malcolm's death came soon after. He had tried to escape, they said. He made it as far as the creek before they caught him. The new master was a cruel man who believed in breaking spirits publicly. They tied Malcolm to a tree, and before the eyes of other slaves, they shattered his legs. One after another, they let him linger, screaming, until his voice gave out and the heat finished him. When Rosa heard, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She kept cooking, kept scrubbing floors, kept pressing the Crawfords' coats as though nothing had happened. But inside, something broke, not in the way her masters intended, but in a way far more dangerous. Her humanity, as they defined it, was gone. She was no longer the smiling servant who bowed her head and obeyed. She had become something else. That winter, Rosa began to change. She chopped firewood with new precision, not to warm the house, but to feel the rhythm of the axe in her hand. Swing, breathe, swing, listen. The tool became an extension of her, not for labor, but for memory. Every strike was a reminder of Malcolm's promise, of Edward's lie, of the Crawfords' cruelty. The other slaves noticed her silence growing heavier. An old man named Elijah once muttered to her, "You quiet tonight, girl." Rosa's reply was cold, her eyes never leaving the fire. "Quiet don't mean empty." Elijah shivered, as though he had glimpsed something in her stare that was no longer human but something older, harder, inevitable. From that night on, Rosa was not just a servant waiting for orders. She was a woman waiting for reckoning, and reckoning, she knew, would come on Christmas Eve. To understand the storm that Christmas Eve unleashed, one must first understand the men who sat at the center of it, the Crawford brothers. They were 4 in number, bound by blood and land, each one carved into a different shape by the same cruel inheritance. Sons of Colonel William Crawford, a man who built his fortune on backs bent and spirits crushed. They were raised not to question but to dominate. If Rosa was the quiet flame waiting to erupt, then the brothers were the fuel, dry and waiting, their arrogance daring fire to consume them. Edward Crawford, the eldest at 42, saw himself as a man of learning. He quoted philosophers over wine, spoke of Rome and Athens while his slaves bent over cane fields until their spines curved like broken bows. He called himself a thinker, but his thoughts were walls designed to keep others beneath him. Edward prided himself on restraint. He didn't need to shout. His cruelty was efficient, calculated, as if suffering were an equation to be balanced. He was the one who dangled freedom before Rosa like a piece of meat before a starving hound, only to rip it away when it suited him. To Edward, deceit was not sin, it was strategy. Robert, 38, was oil where Edward was stone. Smiling, charming, he walked through rooms like a man born to be admired. But beneath that polished veneer lay rot. Robert's pleasure did not come from wine or cards, but from preying on those too young, too powerless to resist. He preferred his victims trembling, wide-eyed. Children barely old enough to understand the words he whispered. He told them it was favor, that it was better to be chosen than ignored. Rosa had seen the aftermath: bloodied rags hidden by the stove, girls who stopped speaking altogether, eyes that looked more dead than alive. Once, there was a girl named Elsie, only 11. She vanished suddenly, with Robert claiming she had been sent north. No wagon ever came. Rosa never forgot the silence that followed. Then there was Silas, 35, the preacher of the family. He wore his Bible like armor and wielded scripture like a whip. Every Sunday he gathered the enslaved in the dirt yard, reading from the good book about obedience and divine order. God made us masters, et declared, and you, as servants, to disobey us is to disobey him. Yet behind closed doors, Silas's sermons turned into punishments. He believed in purification through pain, lashing flesh until it bled in the name of salvation. He kept a ledger of sins, neat and meticulous names, dates, offenses, the number of lashes assigned. Rosa remembered Malcolm's name etched in that book, followed by the tally that had broken his body before he was sold. Silas prayed louder than anyone, but his prayers stank of blood. Finally, Henry, the youngest at 28. He was pure chaos, a storm given human form, where Edward schemed, Robert seduced, and Silas preached. Henry acted. He carried a pistol on his hip at all times, firing it in drunken fits of rage. Once he had shot at his own brother during an argument, laughing when the bullet missed. Another time, a slave child cried during his card game. Henry drew his weapon and shattered the girl's arm with a single shot. He thrived on fear, on the way others flinched when he entered a room. There was no mask, no philosophy. He was violence, raw and unashamed. Together, the Crawfords embodied every face of tyranny. Edward was the deceit of intellect, Robert the corruption of desire, Silas the hypocrisy of piety, and Henry the naked brutality of unchecked power. 4 brothers, 4 demons dressed in tailored coats, inheritors of their father's empire of blood. On Christmas Eve, the house echoed with their presence. The Crawfords had invited no guests that year, preferring the intimacy of family indulgence. The great room swelled with music, borrowed from a neighboring estate. A string trio of enslaved men played softly in the corner as garlands shimmered on the walls. The fire blazed in the hearth, the scent of roasted duck and sugared ham filling the air. Edward sipped brandy while lecturing on Cicero. Robert leaned too close to a trembling servant girl as he refilled his glass. Silas raised a toast, quoting scripture twisted into a hymn of superiority. And Henry stomped his boots, roaring with laughter, daring anyone to challenge his dominance. From the shadows, Rosa moved among them. Her apron was clean, her head bowed, her hands folded like any obedient house girl. She carried platters of duck, poured wine into waiting goblets, polished the frame of the portrait of Colonel Crawford that hung over the mantel. To anyone watching, she was invisible, silent, efficient, forgettable. But beneath the stillness, she was calculating. She knew each of their habits, each of their weaknesses. Edward always retired to his study after too much drink, ledger in hand. Robert prowled upstairs, seeking young prey. Silas drank until scripture slurred on his lips. And Henry would never sit still, his temper too restless for patience. Rosa had studied them for years, Memorized their patterns as carefully as she had memorized the weight of the axe she used for firewood. That very axe lay hidden near the smokehouse, wrapped in an apron, waiting. She had prepared carefully loosened hinges with lard to keep doors from squeaking, stashed cloths to muffle noise, memorized the exact creak of the second stair outside the bedrooms. No detail was too small. If the Crawfords were creatures of habit, then their downfall would be written in those habits. The laughter in the great room grew louder, filling the house like thunder. But outside, the cane fields were silent, their stalks brittle with frost. In the quarters, slaves whispered quietly, aware of something shifting in the air, though they couldn't yet name it. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, as though it too sensed what was to come. Inside, Rosa's eyes flickered once toward the window. The night seemed to press against the glass, waiting. She carried another tray into the parlor, her steps light, her face expressionless. None of the brothers noticed that her gaze lingered a moment too long on the key ring hanging by the back door. None of them saw her fingers tighten ever so slightly around the handle of the platter she carried. To the Crawfords, Rosa was still nothing more than a servant, a shadow in their candlelight, a hand to refill their glasses. But Rosa knew better. She was no longer their possession. She was their reckoning. And in less than a night, the name Crawford would be carved into history, not as masters of Ashwood, but as the hunted prey of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The house at Ashwood Plantation breathed with merriment that night. The fire crackled in the great hearth. Brandy gleamed in crystal glasses, and duck fat sizzled as it dripped from roasting birds. To an outsider, it would have looked like warmth and abundance. But to Rosa, moving silently through the corridors, it was nothing but smoke and lies. Every laugh, every clink of glass was another wound, another memory of Malcolm's last scream carried across the wind. She had prepared for weeks. Each morning, she rose earlier. Each night, she lingered longer, perfecting the rhythm of her chores until no one thought to question her movements. She had gathered what she needed, a rag soaked in lard to silence hinges, a spare apron to wrap the axe, a shawl to mask her presence if needed. Each item was tucked carefully into a corner of the smokehouse, hidden beneath barrels of salted fish and cloth. The axe itself, old, worn smooth from years of splitting wood, was more than a tool now. It was an oath. Rosa tested its weight that afternoon. Swinging low against a log, the crack of wood splitting had not sounded like labor. It had sounded like a drumbeat of destiny. As the night deepened, Rosa's mind turned not to prayer but to remembrance. Once she had prayed when her mother bled out on the cabin floor, when her child slipped away in the winter of 2052, when Malcolm pressed his lips to her forehead and whispered promises of freedom. But prayers had never been answered. Not by God. Not by men. Tonight, there would be no prayer. Only action. She sat in the back pantry, hands folded, eyes lowered, waiting. Beyond the door, the Crawfords drank heavily. Edward had retreated to his study, muttering about headaches as he carried his ledger with him. Robert had disappeared upstairs with a girl no older than 15, her face pale, her hands trembling as she poured wine earlier that evening. Silas sat by the fire, half asleep, his Bible open in his lap, lips moving around fragments of scripture drowned in whiskey. Henry, restless as ever, prowled the halls, pistol swinging from his belt, his boots pounding like thunder. It was almost time. Rosa closed her eyes and recited the names Malcolm, Elsie, Mama, the baby she lost, all those whose cries had gone unanswered. Each name was a weight. Each name was a step. When the clock struck midnight, Rosa Rose, her breathing steady, her face expressionless, she slipped into the back hallway, reached into the linen chest where she had hidden the axe, and unwrapped it from its cloth. The moonlight spilling through the window caught its edge, Dull but sharp enough, hair grip tightened. The first name on her list was Edward. His office smelled of pipe, smoke, and ink. The air thick with the arrogance of decisions that had ruined lives. He sat with his boots propped on a stool, ledger in hand, glass of brandy at his side. He barely glanced up when the door creaked. "Rosa," he said, voice thick with drink. "Something wrong with the fire." She said nothing. She stepped closer. Confusion flickered across his face. He began to rise too slowly. The axe came down in a single, clean arc, striking the crown of his head. The sound was sickening, like a log splitting under frost. His body twitched once, then slumped forward. The glass tipped from the desk, shattering on the rug, spilling brandy into the pages of the ledger. The numbers bled with him. Rosa stood still, her breath even. One name crossed. She left the room quietly, pulling the door to as though Edward were only sleeping. The second name waited upstairs. Rosa climbed the steps carefully, her feet sure on boards she had memorized over years of service. Behind the third door came Robert's voice, low and coaxing, followed by the muffled whimper of the girl. Rosa's jaw clenched. She knocked gently, almost politely. The door opened a crack. Robert's face appeared, half-buttoned shirt, hair tousled, eyes heavy with lust and suspicion. "Rosa," he drawled. "You need something," she answered with the axe. The first blow struck his shoulder, sending him stumbling back. Screaming, the girl shrieked, covering herself with a blanket as Robert scrambled, blood pouring from the wound. Rosa stepped inside, swinging again, this time into his chest. Bone cracked. He tried to reach for the poker by the hearth, but Rosa pinned his hand with her foot and brought the axe down once more. His body jerked. Then still, she turned to the girl, who cowered in the corner, wide-eyed, trembling. Rosa knelt, her blood-soaked apron hanging heavy, and extended her hand. "Go," she whispered. "Go to the cookhouse. Stay with Auntie May. Don't open the door." The girl nodded frantically and fled. Two names crossed. Rosa stepped into the hall again, the axe dripping a trail of red. At the far end, Silas stumbled out of the parlor, Bible still in hand, eyes glassy. He froze when he saw her, his lips shaping her name. "Rosa, what is this?" His gaze dropped to the axe, to the blood soaking her apron. "No, no, child. You don't know what you're doing. It's Christmas, God's day." Rosa's eyes met his, cold and steady. "His day came and went," she said. "This one's mine." He tried to run, tripping on the stairwell. The Bible tumbled from his hand, pages fluttering open. Rosa descended slowly, step by step. The axe gripped tight. He lay groaning at the bottom, blood bubbling on his lips. Scripture muttered in broken fragments. She silenced him with one swing. Three names crossed. Only one remained, Henry. But Henry was no fool now. He had heard the screams somewhere in the house. A door slammed, followed by the thunder of boots. His voice echoed through the halls, rough with rage. "Rosa," he bellowed, "come out." "Witch, you think I don't know what you done? I'll shoot you dead." The house, once filled with laughter, was now a battlefield of silence and shadows. Rosa lifted the axe, her arms steady, her face calm. Three brothers lay dead. One more waited. The storm had begun. The great Crawford house was no longer a place of feasting. It was a tomb. The fire in the hearth smoldered low, casting the room in an orange haze, shadows crawling like restless spirits along the blood-streaked walls. Jonathan, Edward, Silas, three brothers silenced. Their bodies lay where they had fallen, grotesque monuments to the cruelty they had once called power. And yet one voice still echoed, loud and furious, shaking the walls of the house. Henry, his boots thundered across the floorboards, each step punctuated by the click of his pistol. "Rosa," he shouted, his voice ragged with whiskey and rage. "Come out, you think you can do this to us? You think you can touch Crawford blood and live?" Rosa stood at the end of the hallway. The axe heavy in her hands but lighter than it had ever felt. Every step she had taken, every strike she had swung, had led her here. She no longer trembled, no longer heard fear whispering in her chest. All that remained was clarity. Malcolm's face, her mother's cry, the silence of Elsie, all of it had gathered into this one final moment. Henry stormed into the dining room, pistol raised. The table was still set, as if mocking the carnage around it, duck half carved, goblets half full, silver glinting in candlelight now dripping with red. Rosa stepped forward, calm, deliberate, and sat at the head of the table. She placed the axe upon the polished wood as though it were just another piece of cutlery. Then she folded her hands, waiting. Henry's face twisted in disbelief. "You think this is some kind of game?" He cocked the hammer of his pistol. "Get up, wench." Rosa did not move. "I said get up." She rose swiftly, and that small motion was enough to rattle him. He fired. The shot missed, slamming into the chair behind her. The crack echoed through the house like a final trumpet. Rosa didn't flinch. Henry cursed, fumbling to reload, but his hands were clumsy from drink and fury. Too late. Rosa crossed the room in 3 strides. She swung the axe, its blade catching the candlelight before crashing into his arm. He screamed, the pistol tumbling to the floor. Blood sprayed across the tablecloth, staining it darker than any wine. He lunged at her, striking with his fist. But Rosa was faster, her body guided not by rage but by inevitability. She swung again, the axe biting into his side, breaking ribs like dry twigs. Henry staggered back, roaring, clawing for the weapon at his belt. He was the wildest of them, the most brutal, but Rosa had spent years serving his violence in silence. She knew his rhythm, his fury. She sidestepped as he lunged, and with a final, precise arc, she brought the axe down. The blow landed across his chest, dropping him to the floor. He tried to crawl, dragging himself across the polished wood, smearing it red. His voice, once a weapon of fear, broke into gasps. Rosa followed him, slow, measured, not rushing the end. For too long, the Crawfords had hunted the weak, feeding on their fear. Tonight, she would not give Henry the satisfaction of haste. He turned his head toward her, eyes wild, spit and blood foaming at his lips. You're nothing," he hissed. Rosa's chaza held steady. She lifted the axe one final time, and then she swung, ending the last Crawford voice in the room. Silence. For the first time in decades, true silence filled the house. No orders barked, no whips cracked, no girls weeping in shadows. Only the faint hiss of the dying fire and Rosa's steady breath. She stood over Henry's body, her apron drenched, her arms trembling now, not with fear, but with release. She looked at the feast still spread across the table, and untouched but for the blood spattered across its silver and crystal. Slowly, she reached for a goblet, poured herself a measure of wine, and sat once more at the head of the table. She raised the glass, her hand steady despite the carnage surrounding her. "This is for Malcolm," she whispered. "For Mama, for Elsie, for all of us." She drank, the bitter wine burning down her throat, mingling with the iron taste of the blood that clung to the air. The house seemed to breathe around her, not with life, but with reckoning. The portraits of Crawford men stared down from the walls, their painted eyes wide as though they too had witnessed judgment arrive wearing an apron and carrying an axe. Outside, the cane fields lay frozen in the winter air, their stalks brittle, their whispers silent. But Rosa imagined she could hear them stir, as if the earth itself had felt the balance tilt. She sat in the quiet for hours, long after the fire had died, Long after the last echo of Henry's scream faded into the night, she did not run. She did not hide. When the dawn came, spilling pale light through the tall windows, it found her still there at the table, back straight, eyes unblinking. The Crawford dynasty had ended, and Rosa silent. Unyielding, Rosa had spoken in the only language they had ever taught her, steel and blood. Morning came to Ashwood with a strange quiet, as if the land itself held its breath. Frost covered the fields, glittering faintly in the pale sunlight. The cabins of the enslaved stirred slowly, their inhabitants wary of the silence that clung to the big house. Usually, at this hour, the Crawfords' orders echoed across the yard, calls for breakfast, demands for boots to be polished, carriages to be readied. But that morning, nothing came. It was a neighbor who sounded the alarm. Smoke rose faintly from the Crawfords' chimney, but no one answered the gate. A rider was sent to fetch the sheriff, and soon 6 men rode hard across the frosted fields, rifles strapped to their saddles. When they entered the grand house, they found the carnage exactly as Rosa had left it. Edward slumped over his ledger. Brandy spilled across the pages where his figures had blurred into blood. Robert sprawled on the bedroom floor, the sheets soaked, his hand still reaching toward the hearth poker. He never reached. Silas lay at the foot of the stairs, his Bible open to Exodus, the red of his lifeblood staining the verses he had once used as a weapon. And Henry's body was twisted in the dining room, sprawled across the tiles, his pistol inches from his fingers, eyes still wide with disbelief. And there, at the head of the table, sat Rosa, her apron stiff with dried blood, her back straight, her hands folded. She did not run when the sheriff stormed in. She did not speak when they bound her wrists with rope, so tight it cut into her skin. She only turned her head toward the window, her gaze fixed on the frozen cane fields. The sheriff's men cursed under their breath, muttering words like savagery and madness, but none dared linger on the bodies too long. Even in death, the Crawfords seemed to cast a shadow. The men dragged Rosa out of the house, down the grand steps, into the winter air. She stumbled once but did not resist. Around them, whispers spread quickly through the quarters. The enslaved had seen the men ride in, and now they saw Rosa dragged out, bloodied but unbowed. Some gasped, some prayed, others lowered their eyes, but in the silence of their hearts, many felt something else: awe. By the time Rosa reached the Ashwood jail, the story had already begun to spread. The newspapers wasted no time. The Ashwood Massacre, the headlines screamed. 4 white masters butchered in their own home by a single woman. They refused to print her full name, just Rosa, as though stripping her identity might strip the power of her act. They called her insane, claimed she had snapped without reason. But in the cabins and fields, people whispered the truth. Rosa had not lost her mind. She had remembered too well. The trial was scheduled with brutal swiftness. Within 2 days, Rosa was marched into the courthouse, her wrists shackled, her face expressionless. The room was packed townsfolk, planters, merchants, all eager to see justice delivered for the Crawfords. The jury was chosen in less than an hour, 12 white men, most of them acquaintances of the family. Rosa was given no defense, no advocate to speak for her. The judge, sweating in his robes, called her crime an abomination against the natural order. Witnesses testified to her silence, her obedience, her presence in the house that night. None could explain why she had done it, at least none dared say the truth. Malcolm's name was never spoken in court. Neither were the names of the girls Robert had destroyed, nor the men Silas had whipped bloody, nor the children Henry had terrorized. The Crawfords' sins were buried in silence. While Rosa's act was carved into law as savagery, the jury deliberated for less than half an hour. Guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. Back in her cell, Rosa sat by the small window, where a sliver of sky showed through rusted bars. She did not cry. She did not beg. She traced the rhythm of names in her mind like prayers. Malcolm. Mama. Elsie. Eich Repetition steadied her heartbeat. The guards who brought her food whispered about her calmness. She acts like she's already gone, one muttered. But Rosa wasn't gone. She was waiting, carrying her silence like a crown. The day of the execution came cold and gray. The sheriff's men dressed her in white, claiming it was tradition, though most in the crowd saw it as mockery. Yet on Rosa's shoulders, the dress became something else. She walked to the gallows not like a condemned criminal but like a bride moving toward an altar. Her head was high, her gaze unwavering, her steps steady despite the weight of the chains. The crowd gathered thick in the square. Some jeered, shouting curses. Others stared in silence, unable to look away. Among them were enslaved men and women, brought by their masters to witness the warning. Yet their eyes told a different story. They did not see shame. They saw defiance. They saw a woman who had broken the unbreakable. At the base of the gallows, the judge asked if she had any last words. Rosa looked straight ahead, her voice calm. Carrying across the square, I only did what they taught me. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in shock. The sheriff pulled the hood over her head, tightened the rope, and then the floor fell away. Rosa's body stilled. But in that silence, something stirred. They thought they had killed her. They thought the rope would erase her act, that her story would die with her. But Rosa's voice had already taken root. By nightfall, whispers of her last words traveled through Ashwood. By the next week, they reached cabins 2 counties over. And soon, her story was moving faster than any whip, carried by word of mouth, by song, by memory. Rosa was gone. But she was not dead. Not truly. Rosa's breath may have ended on the gallows, but her story did not. Ashwood tried to bury her beneath shame, calling her mad, erasing her name from the newspapers. Yet in the cabins and fields, her memory grew like fire through dry cane. Mothers whispered her name to their daughters as a lullaby. Men carved her initials into trees, secret marks of remembrance. Even those who had never seen her face spoke of the woman with the axe, who on Christmas Eve turned silence into a storm. To the enslaved, Rosa became more than a servant who killed her masters. She was a reminder that even those bound in chains could rise, that even the quietest among them could roar when the time came. Her act was not just violence, it was a declaration, a message carved into blood. The oppressed remember, and memory is sharper than steel. The Crawfords left behind land and debts, but no legacy. Their house stood as a ruin of arrogance, whispered about for decades as cursed. Rosa, in contrast, lived on in memory, not as a monster, but as a woman who dared to speak when no one else could. And so, Herr Ghostlingus, in every story of resistance, in every whisper of rebellion, Rosa is there, silent, unyielding, watching, a reminder that justice may be delayed, buried, chained, but it cannot be silenced forever. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Share it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And subscribe for more untold pieces of America's dark history. Because remembering is its own form of resistance, and Rosa's name deserves to be remembered.